your lecture.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I want to, in a short time, differ a little bit, but very fundamentally, from what we now consider to be the known and agreed narratives of development. First, I'd like to say that development is a normative construct. It's so hugely normative, that it is difficult to objectify it. And that has to be one of the points of departure. The second point is to go back to Gramsci and his notion of hegemony as non-violent dominance. And so when you take development, the assumption is, well, you don't immediately see it. It's a good thing, it's desirable, and therefore we should pursue it. But you don't see the hand behind the clock. And that's the whole meaning of the dominant paradigm that development itself has come to represent. For these two reasons, I want to argue that development is a contested terrain. It's a contested concept. It's not a settled concept at all. And we make a huge mistake if we continue to assume that development means something that all of us can understand. It is something that we all don't understand. It is something we all don't agree on. It is something that is therefore, very diversified. And I want to argue today that development as a paradigm is an instrument of colonization. And that the only way to arrive at that diversification in the meaning of development is to decolonize and deconstruct what has become the dominant paradigm. Let me say that we have made efforts, even as we found in the very brilliant presentation that was made a while ago, to try to operationalize the concept of development. One of the things that I learned in social science methodology is if you have a contested concept that does not lend itself to one single or simple definition, you operationalize it and try to find its empirical reference. So they become measurable reference. And therefore, when we talk about the development indexes, the points about sustainable development and those components, we're trying to break down in an operational sense what development can mean. But even that, again, is very hegemonic. It carries a whole bundle behind that we have to find ways to understand. I like to say that development is not a neutral concept. It's not a neutral concept, and we should not pretend that it is neutral at all. Over the ages, attempts have been made to present it in its neutral form without success at all. It was Kindle-Beecher in the 1950s who first argued that the best way to approach development would be to adopt the gap approach. The gap meaning what separates the so-called industrial world from the developing or underdeveloped world. And so that gap, constitutes the whole process of development. So it's a movement away from a backward society towards a modern society. Well, maybe not backward, but traditional society towards a modern society. Now, this was the era of modernization, and therefore the gap approach fitted very well into the assumptions of modernization theory. But development, therefore, has become fully ingrained in our thinking and in our scholarship in that gap way. And we all seem now to accept that when you're thinking of the targets, the objects, the end, the goals of development, they're already predefined. And all you do is to find ways of bridging that gap. So the more you're able to bridge the gap, the more developed you are assumed to be. The farther you are away from bridging that gap, the farther away from development you are assumed to be. And yet everyone recognizes, even from the last presentation that we had, that development is a highly contextualized process. It's contextualized not just simply in terms of its localization, it's contextualized because even if there is a common understanding, development is not something that can be done for other societies by other people. They can have a notion of how they can develop, but it is the people themselves who must develop themselves. They have to have an understanding of that. And I think that the place to begin, therefore, is to go back to Hamza Alavi. In 1968, he had a very interesting paper on the notion of the overdeveloped state. And Alavi's point of entry is something that we're all familiar with. Alavi argues that all societies, all governments, all economies, all the things that go on emanate from within society. And therefore, it is unlikely that you can have a state that is not on a par with the level of societal development. Now, he was saying this because there is a cultural envelope that comes with every step or stage of development. Now, if that envelope is not congruent, with the level of development, there's a dissonance, and that dissonance begins the problems of development. Now, he says, in relation to Africa and to Asia, he was actually interested in Bangladesh and Pakistan. Now, he says that at the point where the colonial encounter took place, you found the grafting onto people in Pakistan and Bangladesh, certain economic forms, certain structural forms, political and governmental, all of these things that were not on a par with the level of development of these societies. So in relation to those societies, therefore, he argued, the state and the economy were overdeveloped because they didn't have the same sources and the cultural envelope that was necessary for the forms of statehood and the forms of economic production that came into these societies were far, far behind those that were brought from Europe. Now, when you begin to think this way, you would also complement that with what you read from Walter Rodney. Rodney's central argument is that all societies have their trajectories of development. So each society, to each civilization, its own trajectory. And you saw that in that text that was cited a while ago. The whole essence of development is how you can conquer nature, how you can domesticate nature, how you can make nature work for you, how you can multiply productivity, how you can better the welfare and the livelihoods of citizens and so on. That's the essence. And therefore, it is simply, unforgivable to imagine that any society would have gone on without development in that sense. Okay? Rodney says, in the case of Africa, our societies were developing along self-determined trajectories until the point where we had an encounter with what you might regard as a stronger, if you remember biology and osmosis, the permeation of some membrane by some higher ones, and so on. So that's what happened. And then he says that from that point, we lost our autonomy over how to develop. Now, we're no longer in charge. We're no longer in control. These things were no longer determined by us. We were then supplanted and, thrown on the path of a trajectory that is not ours. Now, all the talk about development today will take their bearings from that consideration. I'm sure you also know Cheikh Anta Diop. Cheikh Anta Diop is the Egyptologist, but is also the leading light on discussions on development in Africa. Cheikh Anta Diop says that the moment we lost control of that autonomy, from that moment, we lost our sense of development. That until we are then able to reassert and reclaim the control over that process of development, no development will be meaningful. I'd like to suggest to ourselves, all countries in the world, all societies in the world that have developed, have done so on the basis of what is now regarded as a universe of development and its discourses. Even though I have said that is colonialism written large, because it's non-violent domination. The fact that you're conditioned to think exactly the way we have been conditioned to think. But what does that do for us? It dispossesses us of the drive, of the initiative, and of the capacity to do things on our own. We become clients, we become dependent people. We become people who wait for others to develop things and then we consume them. There is no way we ourselves can be producers in this whole framework, of colonization. You know all of the things that I'm talking about. Take medicine, for instance. A few years ago, we were reminded that breastfeeding is best policy for babies now, as if we didn't know before. As if we didn't know. But it took the intervention of American medical scientists to say, this is now the best, for us to quickly say, yes, 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 yes. Take sickle cell anemia. It ravages our country and the Black race the most. Sickle cell anemia has a racial coloration. We're not able to do anything about it. We wait for those things to be developed, including stem cell therapy, to be developed in Switzerland and other places, and we consume them. Now, think of all the things that we do. We are just a people who have lost the will and the drive to follow through because we are pursuing a process over which we have no control. So what does this mean? It means that in order for you to develop, you must adopt, you must adapt, you must transfer technology, or even you may have to steal technology. Because development today, as defined by the hegemonic hold of the West, is one that is strictly based on science and technology. And therefore, if you refer to the Asian tigers and so on, they say they went to those leading centers of Western technology. If you go around Europe and the United States today, you find hundreds of thousands of Chinese. What are they doing? They're studying those things so that they can take them back home and go to adapt them. As undergraduate students, we were taught that Japan stole technology. And that's how Japan got, its development. So it means that, the measure of development we have, the notions of development we have, are the kinds that Karl Marx had described in India, where he says India has Britain as the mirror of its future. So you look into that mirror, what you see, the skyscrapers, the kinds of things we saw in Dubai, the kinds of bridges, the kinds of airports, and therefore, you say the more you get to this level, the more you attain these heights, the more developed you have become. Now, I'm beginning to come down now to conclude this paper. What do these things mean, all of them? Is it possible to get back to the pristine ages and go to reclaim all of those things? Unfortunately, it is not possible. What can be done, however, is to challenge the predominance of a mode of thought that is so oppressive. It doesn't allow for other forms, other known forms, other alternative forms of development. So you see, for instance, in the clash of civilizations, S.P. Huntington will tell you that one of the greatest challenges to Western civilization is Islamic civilization. And why is Islamic civilization giving such a huge fight so that it can be thoroughly messed up? You have the answer. For everything that is Western, Islam has an alternative. For health, for architecture, name it. All of those things are there. So part of the unforgiving and very treacherous trajectory of development as a colonial construct is the fact that it does not admit of any challenges at all. And that's where we have our greatest challenge. We must, through the things that we write, through our writings, our scholarship, challenge this sense and show that Western development, Western authored development, Western desired development is not all there is to development. That in fact, we have alternative sources. And we stand on very good and solid grounds in this manner because we have had from India, from Sri Lanka, from Korea, from China, we have had development paradigms that can be culturalized. You have to have the filters for your own cultural envelopes to put these things within them. Otherwise, if we don't have those cultural envelopes that can make us owners of our development process, development itself will mean what government wants rather than what the people want. And that, breeds, this great gap between government itself on the one hand and the citizens on the other hand. The citizens have notions of development that are not, agreeable with those of government. Why? Because government is a conduit. It's a conduit, for Western hegemony. And all the things we hear about foreign aid, about technical support, all of these things are part of the instrumentalities, of perpetuating this very terrible experience, that we have had with development. I'd like to argue, in conclusion, therefore, that if we do not deconstruct and provide alternatives, the way the Indians have successfully done, the way the Japanese have done, the way the Chinese have done, the way the Koreans have done, through decolonization, scholarship, and entry points, we might just continue to wallow in this quagmire that Sheikh Anta Diop referred to, where we have so much development, quote and unquote, around Lagos, Victoria Island, Unilag, and so on. And we have so much underdevelopment, even around these headquarters of the centers of the periphery. If we have to give ourselves a measure of movement from our marginalized status in the universe of development, we must insist that what works for us is not what they say works for us. It's what works for us in a self-determined way. And we must retain a great deal of the autonomy of not only initiative, but also action. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Dr. Oni, you take a few questions.